Hello, I'm Nanette Stahl. I'm the Joseph and Seal Mazer Librarian for Judaic Studies at the Yale University Library. And I'm going to be talking today with Professor Stephen Fraade. Stephen Fraade is the Mark Taper Professor of the History of Judaism at the university. And I'd like to talk to him about his work, his areas of interest and research, and his classes at the university, as well as books and other resources that he would recommend to students who are working in ancient Judaism or in the rabbinic texts of ancient Judaism. And that he would recommend to students who are sort of interested in beginning to learn a little bit about the subject. So I'm going to turn now to Professor Fraade, and I hope that we can get our conversation going. We'll begin. I'd like to welcome you, Professor Fraade, to our little gathering here, and to thank you for coming and talking about your area, which is ancient Judaism. And I'll just give a brief introduction as to who you are. Professor Fraade is the professor of history of Judaism, and also the chair of the program in Judaic Studies. And in the past, he was also chair of the Department of Religious Studies. So you've been doing a lot of work here at the university over the years. But besides being an administrator, you're of course also a great scholar. And I just want to tell people who may be watching this video what some of your work is. You teach courses on rabbinic literature, the history of the Second Temple period, and early rabbinic Judaism. You also work on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you offer seminars on Midrashic, Mishnaic, and Talmudic texts. Now, Midrashic and Mishnaic may not be terms that a general audience would be familiar with, so I'll very briefly say, but I'm going to have you define these terms perhaps in greater detail. The Midrash is rabbinic exegesis on the Bible, and the Mishnah is the first code, post-biblical code. And the Talmud is then a commentary on the Mishnah by rabbis in Babylonia, and also rabbis and of course scholars in Babylonia and in the land of Israel. So we have two Talmuds actually, the Babylonian Talmud and the Palestinian Talmud, as it's referred to in English. To begin our discussion, I was wondering if you could talk to me a little bit about what your areas of research are in a little more detail than what I gave, and maybe you might mention what your latest publication is. What are you working on right now? What's taking up your time and attention? What areas are you working on?
Well, thank you for that generous introduction. I'm working on a lot of things at once, sometimes maybe too many things at once, but the two main large projects that I've been working on for some years and continue to produce, publish, and for the foreseeable future are one has to do with the question of multilingualism in ancient Jewish society. As you may know, Jews of all periods and places typically have used more than one language at any given time. So Hebrew, of course, the language of the Bible, is a continual part of Jewish life. The liturgy, for the most part, is in Hebrew. The study of the Bible, the Tanakh, and you mentioned Midrash and Mishnah, both of which are written in Hebrew, albeit a later form of Hebrew than the Bible. So Hebrew is a constant in Jewish life, and of course with the creation of the modern state of Israel, Hebrew became not just a language of scholars or prayer or holy ritual activities, but became also a secular language, a language spoken and used by a very broad population. So the Hebrew is one language that's kind of defined Jewishness in a sense, really from all the way back. Abraham is called Avraham HaIvri,
Right.
Abraham the Hebrew, however that's understood. So, and by most traditions, the Hebrew goes back to the very first humans, at least as it's understood. So that's one constant, but throughout Jewish history, Jews have also lived under foreign governments, foreign empires have had to interact with cultures not necessarily their own. So in the ancient period, which I'm studying, that's largely Greek-speaking, whether Hellenistic or Roman is very much part of Jewish life. If you go to, say, ancient synagogue ruins from the land of Israel for the period I'm studying in the first millennium, you'll find many Greek inscriptions in synagogues, often alongside Hebrew, but also the third language that was in use in ancient times was Aramaic, which is a relation to Hebrew, a kind of cousin of Hebrew, but also a language shared with other surrounding peoples. The Christians, particularly Eastern Christians, adopted a dialect of Aramaic called Syriac. The Persian Empire used in the 5th century and 4th century used Aramaic as the kind of official language of the empire. So there you have immediately Jews having to use, communicate, inscribe, produce literature in 3 languages. And typically that's the pattern throughout Jewish history. That is, that there's Hebrew, as it were, the ancestral language. There's the language of the surrounding culture, whether that's Spanish or Arabic or German or English for us in the United States. And then often there's a third language, which is something of a bridge language between Hebrew and that host cultural language. So Aramaic is one example of that, in that it's not specifically a Jewish language, although it's used by Jews as well as by others, but it's written, Jewish Aramaic is written in Hebrew script. Yiddish is a modern example of a kind of a bridge between Jewish life and German, written again in Hebrew script, although most of the vocabulary is German, but it's a kind of hybrid language, or Judeo-Arabic, as you know, for Jews of North Africa, or Ladino, which essentially is a kind of bridge between Spanish and Hebrew, again written in Hebrew script. So I'm interested in really the earliest period of this pattern of Jews having to speak and write and express themselves and navigate within multiple languages, and that often poses challenges, or which language should be used for which purpose. And particularly in an educational context, we have these debates down to the present day. What language should be used for instruction? Should bilingual education be emphasized or discouraged because it may not give as much attention to the national language or the ancestral language? So these are issues that go back to ancient times, and particularly the history of ancient Judaism is an interesting place to study this, because that's where the phenomenon first comes about. And we know that in the ancient world in which Jews lived, that this was not a specifically Jewish phenomenon, that in Egypt people had to use Egyptian and Greek, or in Syria people had to use Syriac and Greek. We have an exhibit here at Yale of a very important city that was excavated at the beginning of the 20th century by Yale Dura Europos, and you can see there's at least 20 languages represented in the inscriptions and the writings found in that location. And one of the communities living in Dura Europos was a Jewish community, because there's a cemetery. So we have, again, Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew evidenced in the synagogue at Dura Europos, just as the surrounding churches and pagan places of worship also give evidence to multiple languages. So that's of interest of mine. How do these different languages get weighed one more appropriate to one purpose or function than another. As you know, Jewish prayer is mainly in Hebrew.
Right.
Why didn't they pray in Greek?
But they did in Aramaic.
In
so-
Greek-speaking places, but there is Aramaic in the service, but certainly the liturgy, but it's certainly not as much as Hebrew. And this is a long-standing debate. Is it better for people to give one example from rabbinic literature, is it better to say the Shema, Deuteronomy 6, starting verse 1 following, is it better to say it in Hebrew, because that's the ancestral language in which it's always been recited, and that's the language in which it's recorded in Scripture. But if they don't understand what they're praying, maybe it would be better for them to say the Shema in Greek, in a language they understand, and therefore perhaps be able to pray with more feeling, or at least understanding of what they're praying. So we have rabbis debating this. On the one hand, better they should say it in Greek than not say it at all, says
Right.
one rabbi. Another rabbi says, no, this is the kind of central prayer in our tradition, and it should be uniting all of Jews, no matter where and when they're living, by reciting in the language of that it's recorded in the book of Deuteronomy.
There's one question I wanted to ask you, I don't mean to interrupt you.
So just give that as an example.
Right. But how come Latin never took hold? Because after all, the Romans ruled the world and ruled the Middle East for many years. But it seems that even though the Romans were Latin speakers, it's Greek that still remains the language that most communication took place in that part of the world, which was the Mediterranean.
So this is what you're saying is true not just of Jewish communities. I mentioned synagogues in which we have a lot of inscriptions in Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic, but really nothing in Latin. But this is true for churches and for the Eastern Mediterranean in general, where Latin is evidenced, and we see this at Juria Opus, it's evidenced as being used within the military. It was among Romans speaking to one another, or people within the military used Latin. But in their dealing with the larger populations, the larger cultures that they are ruling over, Greek appears to have been the language of administration when dealing with the local population. So if one wants to speak of a kind of lingua franca, a kind of shared language under Roman rule, it would not be Latin, it would be Greek. And that's partially because the Greek had long existed in the eastern parts of the Mediterranean at least since the conquest by Alexander the Great in the 330s BCE. So Roman citizens, Roman communities were in some sense building on the colonies that had previously been established under Hellenistic rule in the 4th, 3rd, 2nd centuries. So they never imposed, it appears, Latin on the subject populations as a language of communication. Only within the military or within the Roman officialdom do you see Latin being used.
So the Romans also had to deal with bilingualism.
Yes, and this is a subject of quite a bit of scholarship, the
interesting.
bilingualism of Greek and Latin
Yeah.
in the ancient Roman world. What languages get used when people inscribe tombstones, or what language gets used in correspondence within the empire. So certainly what language gets used in education, to be an educated Roman citizen, what languages should you know? And we know there that we have many bilingual texts from Roman educational contexts in which Greek and Latin are used alongside each other, because the assumption is that both are languages of some high culture and need to be mastered by people who want to get ahead in the world. So that's one large project. The other, I'll be briefer, the other project is I've been asked to produce a new translation and commentary to something called the Damascus document, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls for Oxford University Press. So that's going to occupy quite a bit of time next few years, retranslating the text and producing a commentary that will be intended for a, should we say, a sort of educated lay audience that is not specialists, but on the other hand, to aspire to a certain level of scholarly excellence that would make it of interest and importance to scholars as well as non-scholars. So
Yeah.
that's,
Because the Dead Sea Scrolls, of which you are a great scholar as well, and you sometimes co-teach with Professor John Collins, correct? So there's this collegiality, and each one of you brings something else to the topic.
yeah, I mean, Yale has a long history of scholarship relating to the Dead Sea Scrolls. The initial discovery and publication of the scrolls involved a leading scholar at Yale, Millard Burroughs, who was then at the Yale Divinity School, but happened to be at the head of what's called the Albright School in East Jerusalem at the time the scrolls were discovered. So there's been a long, continuous history of Yale scholars and students being interested in, engaged in. John Collins, you mentioned that the Yale Divinity School is certainly one of the leading scholars in that field, as are others at Yale.
Yes, so and this is a subject that continues to fascinate not just scholars but lay people.
Yes, very much so.
The first, such an ancient version of the Bible that everybody is always so intrigued and fascinated with what did the Bible look like in antiquity, and we have these texts that are online, by the way.
Yes,
and can be
increasingly online.
And so that anybody can access the text, because you have to know the language.
So the ancient scribal methods meet the modern digital
Yes,
age.
something like that. But and it of course has the ability to work with these manuscripts digitally has allowed all these little fragments to be put together, and at least digitally to see the complete text, which is like a recreation of what was destroyed over the centuries. So digital knowledge of the scrolls have made possible all kinds of discoveries that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. So that's really great. I know you've taught quite a few classes, seminars, undergraduates and graduates. Could you just mention briefly some of the classes you taught in the most recent years?
Yeah.
Students might be interested.
I've been teaching at Yale. I'm finishing my 35th year of teaching at Yale, and one course that I've taught since I came to Yale in 1979, which I continued to teach. Just finished teaching this semester. I call a introduction to the history of ancient Judaism, and then the subtitle of the course is From Temple to Talmud, which in some ways it's the subtitle that sums up in many ways the emphasis of the course, and it's a broad sweeping introduction beginning approximately 500 BCE to 500 CE, so it covers a good 1,000 years of history, although it focuses more on the, let's say, 200 BCE to maybe 300 CE, and it's a broad historical survey of what I consider to be the most important events, personalities, developments, but it also tries to get students to become familiar with the primary sources, with the actual texts, of course in English translations. It's an introductory course, so in the course of the semester expose students to a variety of different types of apocalyptic Jewish texts, Dead Sea Scrolls, wisdom texts, and then we move in eventually to rabbinic literature and give the students an introduction to Midrash, Mishnah, and Talmud. But the overall theme of the class is how Judaism in this period interacts with the surrounding cultures, particularly Hellenization and Romanization, but how Judaism is transformed by the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 CE at the hands of the Romans, from being a religion that's mainly defined by sacrificial worship in a centralized temple in Jerusalem, which isn't to say there weren't other aspects of Jewish life, but that was the centerpiece, you might say, of Jewish observance, practice, identity, to a period in which the temple is gone, sacrificial worship is no longer possible, and how does Judaism survive and adapt itself to changing circumstances? And this is also very interesting because it's exactly at this period that Christianity, or the followers of Jesus to begin with, take root as at first a Jewish movement, one among many. So the period in which, the conditions under which Rabbinic Judaism emerges are in many ways the same, certainly the same time, the same geographic location, some of the same struggles that produce Christianity. Obviously both Christianity and Judaism have evolved and changed over the millennia since then, but the fundamental aspects of both great world religions have their genesis in this time and period. So that's of great interest to many of the students as well. So that's my most introductory and broadest survey, which I'm sure over the 35 years has changed bit by bit. Every year something is taken out or added to the syllabus, but it's basically remained the same. Of course, it was changed as the students, and they come sometimes with different interests and different backgrounds and different sets of questions, but it's very rewarding course to teach.
Imagine. There's probably lots of give and take,
Yes,
with
yeah.
students who have some background in, Christian background,
Yeah.
Jewish background, and as Yale has such a diverse body of students, everybody brings aspects of their own culture and
Right.
religious life into the classroom.
And
It makes for very interesting
yeah.
discussions.
Lately I've been having actually more divinity school students than in the past coming and taking this course because they're interested in the ancient Judaism from their perspective, interest in the origins of Christianity. So that makes for interesting conversations as well.
Well, the study of ancient Judaism at Yale University right now is like blossoming.
Yeah,
It's
well,
at
we
a
are-
high point.
We are certainly
And
considered,
with-
I'm told, one of the leading centers for that
Yes.
area of study.
So that's good for potential students to know
Yeah,
about.
no, it's very,
That this is the place
yeah,
for study of
I think so,
of
yes.
ancient Judaism and the beginnings of Christianity. And of course, the Divinity School at Yale contributes to this study, plus the Department of Religious Studies. So there's such a broad selection and possibilities. This is really a very rich environment in which to study this subject. So I was going to ask you to define one of the areas of study in rabbinic literature, and the three that I mentioned before was Midrash, Mishnah, and Talmud. Mishnah is actually Midrash, is actually the latest, isn't it, or does it predate and it's just sort of a continuum?
Yeah,
But I know of some Midrash collections, at least that I've heard, that actually come about in the Middle Ages and are not, Palestinian and so forth. So I would say, why don't you briefly speak about one of these, maybe Midrash, just for
Well, let me say by
students.
way of introduction, people often use the term rabbinic literature.
Yes,
That
it's
defines
very
a lot
broad.
of what I teach and research. Of course, strictly speaking, rabbinic literature extends down to the present time.
That's right.
If there are rabbis who are writing and producing writings of a kind of sacred nature, commenting on the Bible or collecting opinions about Jewish law, then that's rabbinic literature. And the first rabbis, so the first, we could say, rabbinic literature, it goes back, at least the traditions, to the 1st century CE. The earliest rabbinic texts that we have in edited form probably begins with the Mishnah around the year 200 CE. So at least from the 1st century to the present time, one can speak of rabbinic literature. But often when people speak of rabbinic literature, or sometimes they'll say classical rabbinic literature, what they mean is the literature produced by the rabbinic sages of, let's say, the 1st through the 5th or 6th centuries CE. And because that was the formative period, that was the period in which most rabbinic texts, the Talmud, the Midrash, the Mishnah, came into being, if not in their final forms, then at least in their penultimate forms. So often when people speak of rabbinic literature, what they really mean is that sort of classical formative period of the first, let's say, 5-6 centuries. And similarly, when people speak of rabbinic midrash, one could say, well, every day rabbis are giving sermons and are interpreting the Bible, so rabbinic midrash continues, not just by rabbis, but midrash by Jews, as activity of interpretation of the Bible continues down into our own day. But often when people say rabbinic midrash, they have something more narrow in mind, and that is the midrash of the classical, we may say, rabbinic period, again from the first to the 5th century in the land of Israel to the 6th century in Babylonia. But the production of those writings and the collecting of those traditions continues right through the medieval period, early modern into modern days. So we have certainly medieval collections. The midrashic biblical interpretation takes somewhat of a different shape in the Middle Ages. It tends to be more commentaries written by individual rabbis, great such as Rashi or Ibn Ezra or Nachmanides, Maimonides, so that we have a sense of an author, an individual who's writing a continuous commentary on a biblical book or on a Mishnaic or Talmudic treatise, whereas the midrashic and rabbinic literature in general of the so-called classical period, the first 5 or 6 centuries, are generally not authored by individual writers. They're kind of anthologies, they're collections. We generally don't know who the editor, who it was that gathered and put it together in the form that we have it. Individual sayings or teachings are attributed to a named Rabbi so-and-so said this.
Right.
So in that sense, the activity of biblical interpretation continues, but sometimes the form that it takes changes over time. So in the other thing I would say in general is that the traditional way of studying rabbinic literature, by which I mean in the yeshiva world or in the other traditional context for Jewish learning, tends to study rabbinic literature as a kind of self-contained, self-enclosed system, body of knowledge. There is in a certain sense a rabbinic canon, just as there is a biblical canon, that is which are the books that are approved for study and outside of the realm of what's approved for study. So traditional study, which is very important to the survival and thriving of Jewish life, tends to view rabbinic literature, or including the biblical literature, as a kind of self-enclosed, that is, the Talmud with its Talmudic commentaries, or the Bible with its rabbinic commentaries. One of the hallmarks of academic study of rabbinic literature is certainly not to in any way detract from the importance of that form of study, but is to study rabbinic literature in its larger cultural context. So this would be let's say, in relation to the Greco-Roman world, or in relation to Christianity, or in the Babylonian context, increasingly in relation to Persian culture of the time and place. So the assumption is that the rabbis did not create these wonderful writings, or become writings, because many of them were probably oral in transmission originally, did not do so in a vacuum, did not do so only by being in contact with other rabbis or being influenced by other rabbis, that they're part and parcel of a larger social, cultural, linguistic environment. And so the academic study of these subjects, meaning in the secular universities, would tend to give more recognition, acknowledgement, attention to the context. And just to give one example, if one is studying the rabbinic interpretations of the Bible in Midrash, it's important to see what are Christians doing with those same biblical texts, or what are Samaritans doing with that same biblical text. And in a later period, how does this compare to what how Muslims are interpreting the Quran, or how are Greek philologists interpreting Homer. It doesn't have to be scriptural per se, and we know that quite a bit of what seems to have informed these very characteristically rabbinic forms of writing can be understood better with a clearer understanding of the context in which these things were produced. That doesn't mean the rabbis were consciously borrowing or cutting and pasting from Greek literature, but that they were aware of it, absorbed a certain amount of it, and it shows itself in rabbinic literature. Similarly, you mentioned the Mishnah. If one is studying the Mishnah in a critical academic setting, one is studying it not just as the foundation for the Talmud, which of course is a very important way of viewing it, but how does the Mishnah, as you used the word code or collection of laws, compared to what's going on with Roman law at the same period, or a Zoroastrian law in the Persian context. So we tend to be much more interested, and one doesn't preclude the other and isn't necessarily better than the other, but they have different purposes. So the academic context for the study of rabbinic literature tends to be much more contextual, which of course means having to know other languages besides Hebrew and Aramaic. We have some scholars here at Yale who are very engaged in the study of the Babylonian Talmud in its Persian context as an approach that's been around for quite a while, but has received in recent years much more of a kind of boost in the attention given to it. So all of these types of rabbinic literature have a kind of internal history within the Jewish communities as they are transmitted from generation to generation, but at any given point they also have their own context in the broader culture, society, and we can learn a good bit from literatures of other communities as well as from archaeological evidence, numismatic evidence, documentary evidence of ancient texts that have been stored away and survived from ancient times. So this is an increasingly kind of broad area of focus, and that also means that we're drawing people into the study of rabbinic literature from these other areas who are interested in the kind of the opposite route. What can they learn about Roman law, particularly in the Eastern Roman provinces, from studying early rabbinic law? Or what can they learn about the process of interpretation from the study of rabbinic midrash? So the flow of information and the attention goes really in both directions.
Yes, oh, I just want to mention the personal connection in my life. My husband, Professor William Hallow, did the same thing for biblical,
Yes.
where his field was among studying ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerians and so forth. Also, his interest was studying Bible in its ancient context, which had to do with the Middle East and Mesopotamia, and finding mutual influences.
Yeah, it's interesting. For whatever reason, I think this came to rabbinic literature. I mean, there were early pioneers in this, but for the most part it's come somewhat belatedly, and that's because, to some extent, the traditional way of studying these texts is not with an eye to what's outside the canon, but really only what's sort of self-contained within the canon, and there's tremendous value to that, but it's only part of the picture.
That's right, it is. If we were, speaking to undergraduates at Yale who might be interested in either majoring in this area or taking classes in this field, and we're interested in doing some preliminary reading on the subject, are there any books that you could recommend? And I certainly hope that they're here at the Yale University Library, and I'm sure they are.
Yeah.
So what books might you suggest, or a few that if people wanted to sort of start inquiring a little bit about this area of study, what books would you recommend to them?
Well, it depends on, of course, what the level of interest and how much
Right.
you want to go into. There are some books that are written mainly for classroom use. My colleague Christine Hayes has a book, I think it's called The Emergence of Judaism. Martin Jaffe has a book called Early Judaism. Shia Cohen has a book from the Maccabees to Mishnah. So there are several of these one-volume attempts to sort of particularly get at the earliest, the kind of the origins, the early period of the emergence of rabbinic Judaism, all of which I would recommend. If one wants to go a step further, there are 2 volumes that were edited by several people, but the main editor was Shmuel Safrai, Safrai, called The Literature of the Sages. It came out separated by some years, but in 2 volumes of essays on various aspects of rabbinic literature that's intended as much for the layperson as for the scholar. So it's a somewhat of a more sophisticated level than the previous books. I don't mean to say are not sophisticated, but they're intended for beginners. But if one wants to go beyond that, then the 2 volumes of the language of the literature of the sages. One can find it listed under Shmuel, Shmuel Safrai, Safrai. There's also some great work of really beginning of the 20th century was a work by a German Protestant scholar, the History of the Jews in the Time of Jesus Christ by Emil Schurer. And that's certainly a work that's very much outdated by now, but 2 scholars, I think in the late 70s, early 80s, Geza Vermees, Vermees, and Martin Goodman, both at Oxford University, produced what scholars call the New Schurer. It is a revised version of Schurer's history of the Jews in the period of the New Testament. And that came out, I think, in 4 volumes, but any part of it would be interesting, particularly for the late Second Temple period, early rabbinic times. So that, together with the Safrai volumes on the literature of the sages, would certainly keep one busy for quite a while, as well as the books I mentioned. There's also one by Robert Goldenberg, also called something about the emergence of Judaism. So those are several volumes, and of course, the more one reads, the more one is led to other things to read.
And of course, our faculty here at Yale has published quite a bit on this subject,
yeah, I mentioned Christine Hayes' introductory book.
Yes.
My own books are less introductory, but they're certainly
accessible.
Right.
So I just want to point out that I've created study guides in the area of ancient Jewish study and literature. There's one on ancient Judaism, classic Judaic texts, and so forth. And certainly the point of all of this was to introduce students to the field and to help them move along and get more involved. And I certainly hope that this discussion, plus the study guides, and I also want to point out that Oxford Bibliographies Online, we now have it online, has a separate section for Judaic studies, and you can put in any topic you want, and you'll get a whole list, an introduction by scholars in the field or a scholar in the field, and then recommendations for reading. So in addition to the work that the librarians here at the Yale Library are doing, there is the Oxford Bibliographies Online, which is an excellent resource.
Yeah.
and.
I have a colleague, Yair Furstenberg, who's
Yes.
an Israeli scholar, a younger scholar, who did what you're referring to, the bibliography on rabbinic literature.
On rabbinic
So
literature.
I've seen it and know that it's
Yeah.
very good.
Yes, and there are others, so it's well worth taking a look, and we have it online. It really doesn't
Mhm.
require any massive work in order to access the information. So, thank you so much for coming
My
by,
pleasure.
and
Thank you. Of course, without the books, which you tend to so passionately, we wouldn't be able to do our work. So the
Well,
the
thank
relation,
you.
relation
Thank
to the
you very
library
much.
here at Yale, one of the great libraries of Judaic scholarship, is very important for our teaching and research. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate that. We try and support the program in Judaic Studies and all the other programs that relate to our work as much as we can, and are always open to suggestions, advice, whatever people want to bring to us that could help us do our work better.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you so much. And I actually realized that I did not introduce who I was, and I'm the Mazer bibliographer or specialist in Judaic Studies here at the Yale University Library. And I hope that this discussion will be of help to students, this is whom we're aiming at, in doing some work in the field of ancient and early modern, maybe very early modern in Stephen's case, Judaic Studies.